what I'm going to do, as this has been prompted to remember, is look at the basis of vaccination and try and get into the mindset of the vaccinators and see what it's based on and try and follow that rationale somewhat and then see if there's anything that's missing so that we can come to a different conclusion. Germ theory is basically this idea that germs cause disease. And we have this idea that Pasteur, he supposedly showed that microbes cause disease and they can be transferred from one person to another through the passage of air. And if we look up any kind of textbook or web page, we'll find that he's basically known as the kind of father of medicine in that respect. However, this is not entirely true. And it's also well documented. So, for example, 100 years before Pasteur, a Dutch scientist in 1762 said there was a special organism by which each infectious disease was produced, that microbes were capable of reproduction outside the body and they might be conveyed from place to place by air, which is pretty effectively germ theory. So, and there were many kind of refutations and ideas put forward since or before Pasteur, so that he was actually somebody that promoted an idea. He wasn't somebody that dreamt up this idea in the first place. A contemporary of Pasteur, however, was a guy called Beauchamp, and he looked at three things: sepsis, which is how wounds become septic, fermentation, and a specific disease of grapes. And he was actually the first person to introduce the term microzyma, which is where we get the idea of microbe from. And this was done in 1857. At a time when most people were thinking of these things as happening spontaneously, what we call spontaneous generation. So if someone got ill, meat would become decayed through things spontaneously growing in decayed life stuff. So we even thought that life itself could spontaneously emerge out of nothing, as it were. So he wasn't too happy with those ideas, and he found that, in fact, in sepsis, when wound becomes septic, there were small microorganisms that break down the dead tissue, and as a byproduct, you'll see the pus that you'd see in fermentation, in sepsis. In fermentation, people thought that sugar solution would turn into alcohol. And he showed that there was a microorganism that would break down the sugar, and the byproduct was alcohol. And similarly, in this grape disease, he found a microbe living on the skin of the grape, and that microbe would produce a toxin, and that toxin would affect the quality of the wine, which is what he was basically commissioned to find out what was going on about. So this was the microzyma. So the thing here also is that he hadn't distinguished the various microbes from each other. He hadn't found the difference between bacteria and fungus and viruses and so on, or, for that matter, our own white blood cells. He just knew there were these small organisms at work within the greater whole. So, let's think about something here. How many cells do you think are in the human body? Well, let's just say there are that many, right? 50 to 100 trillion, right? Just like to skip that bit. And now, as a percentage, what percentage of that, now think of your cells in terms of all your skin cells, the layer of skin cells, they're microscopically small, blood cells, all the blood vessels are made of cells, neurological cells, connective tissue, bone cells, muscle cells, and so on and so on. All of that comprises your 50 to 100 trillion cells. What percentage of that do you think, as a number, are microbes in your body, do you think? Guess. Somebody, anybody, everybody. What percentage?
80.
80, somebody says. All right. Any advance on that, or de-advance on that? Let's go with 80 then, all right? Okay. No-brainer. But, however, according to the Lancet, Feb 08, 2003, if you multiply that number by 10, all right, you would get roughly the number of microbes in our body. And that's probably an underestimate, okay? 90% of which exist in your digestive tract. So, what Beauchamp was alluding to was that these microbes already exist within the body. And rather than an illness being caused by something coming in, something changes within the body, and as that change occurs, then these microbes can do something. Because he found these microbes that were there at the beginning, during the disease, than after the illness. So he couldn't explain illness just simply by a microbe coming in and getting you, as it were. All right? So Pasteur, however, promoted this idea that each specific disease was caused by an infecting microbe, therefore coming from the outside. He'd never managed to demonstrate that ever in his lifetime, but he promoted that particular idea. Béchamp, on the other hand, said that it was the soil that was important. Now, if, according to Pasteur, the illnesses are caused by things that come and get you, right, and they set up shop inside you, and they create pathological symptoms, how do you avoid and treat disease if Pasteur was right? What do you have to do in principle? None of these questions are going to be difficult. There are no trick questions, just to get us to go through my mind process. So in the end, you end up thinking like me. What do we do if Pasteur is correct? You have to get rid of the germ. You do what? What do you do with them? What do you want to do with them? Destroy them, kill them. Does that make sense? So you'd have to kill them. And if you want to avoid illness, cut a long story short, you avoid contamination. You avoid people with the illness. If someone's got measles, and you don't want to get measles, you don't go near that person with measles. Otherwise, you can be responsible for giving them the disease. All right? However, if Béchamp is correct, we somehow have to address the soil. Does that make sense? So what does that mean in practical terms to human beings, given that the soil is us? Sorry? Healthy lifestyle. So what kind of things do we have to do to boost immunity? These are all complicated things, right? I want simple. Eat well. So we have to look at our nutrition. What else? Sanitation. And that means toxins. Okay? Cut a long story short. What else have we mentioned? Sleep. So we have to eat well, nutrition, we have to look at toxins. Sleep. Anything else? Exercise, exactly. The right amount, not too much, not too little. Anything else? Fresh air, exactly. And some mental and emotional things we have to look at as well, don't we? Because very commonly people get ill when they're stressed emotionally and when they're stressed mentally. So we have all these kinds of things to address. Now, we could then ask the question, which medical paradigm did you invest in? Was it Pasteur or Béchamp? Pasteur. So the question is why? What do you think of that? Yeah, why was it fashionable? Why did we kind of go for Pasteur rather than Béchamp?
Fear.
Sorry? Yeah. He did that eventually. And he also created a Pasteur Institute eventually, and also they created vaccines and so on a little bit after his time. So things came out of that. But why did we decide to invest our money in Pasteur and not in Béchamp? It was easier, wasn't it? Yeah. What was easier about it?
You don't have to take responsibility.
Exactly, you don't take responsibility. So you're just saying that I got this disease because somebody gave it to me. I was sitting on the bus one day and they sneezed and they obviously had the flu, and I went home and lo and behold, that night started to develop symptoms of flu, and that person gave it to me. So nothing to do with how I live, what I eat, my nutritional status, my fresh air, my this, my that, my emotional state, nothing to do with any of that at all. It's because somebody gave me the disease. So there's something kind of psychological palatable about that approach that people kind of thought, yeah, we'll run with Pasteur. So let's start to think like this. So on an individual level, that was attractive. Now let's have a look at European society in the 19th century. Pasteur was born in 1822. So his things were around 1860s, 1870s. And what was going on in Europe about this time? It was in France, pretty much the same thing was going on in most of Northern Europe. What was the kind of big deal in Europe in the 19th century?
Victorian belief that you could fix it.
You could fix it, yeah, very true. An industrial revolution, so this kind of technological age started to take on. And what did that mean for people? Standard of living changed. What changed?
People got around more.
People
Got around more.
Yeah, they moved more. They certainly did because there were transportation. Sorry? We lost touch with natural rhythms.
Cities expanding.
And so on and so forth. So basically, we moved ostensibly from a kind of rural living, growing our food and so on, to moving into towns. And what we have to appreciate is that those towns weren't physically there before. So I think over the course of the next 60 years or so, something like 12 towns, 12 major cities in Europe became 150. So they didn't go in to rent accommodation and get various things set up for themselves. They created these towns as the influx of people came in to justify those accommodation. And people's living conditions were very, very poor. It was a fairly orthodox doctrine that it was those living conditions that were causing so much disease. So people went to work from as young as 5 years old. They would go off to work and do a 12-hour shift, and then the other people would come back and share their house and their bed while they went off to work, and so on and so forth. So quite appalling living conditions. And apparently we killed more children in that era than at any other time in history, wars included. So very, very high death rates, very high disease rates, and fairly standard medicine will say that's because of the way people live. So we have to bear that in mind. We have the individual kind of idea that that's a very attractive approach, Pasteur, and we also have this kind of cultural and society push for the Pasteur parody. So if in fact we were to adopt a more Béchamp approach, looking after the soil of our population, as it were, who is going to have to pay for that? How is that going to happen? Given that people were living in 5 to a room and working 12 hours a day, and there weren't enough to eat, and there wasn't sanitation, we couldn't get food to people, and so on. How are we going to address our medical issues? What are we going to have to do?
Possible.
Just in principle. I'm not asking you for policies. I know we're tied up with government. Sorry? Yeah, the bosses of the government. And who ultimately is it then? The bosses or the government? Yeah, because the government are going to have to pay for it from what? Taxes. And they only get their money if they're being paid enough to pay taxes. Does that make sense? So ultimately it comes from the landowners, the industrialists and so on. So there was a kind of pressure, shall we say, just as a pressure exists now, to placate the industrialists whilst also having to, on some level, placate the masses. Right? And what's necessarily convenient for the industrialists isn't necessarily convenient for you. So convenient food and agriculture and agrochemicals may be convenient for people that want a mass farm, but they might not be convenient for your health. Does that make sense? So I just want to look at that little principle. So as we bear that in mind, we see that there are pressures, as it were, to kind of force one agenda as compared to another agenda. So let's move on. Edward Jenner, what was he supposedly famous for? Anybody know? Anybody any idea? Anybody kind of an inkling?
Smallpox.
Yeah, smallpox. So he supposedly noticed that people who developed cowpox wouldn't develop smallpox. And therefore, he thought that people who had immunity to cowpox, later thought to be the antibody, he didn't have any idea about antibodies at the time, they thought that immunity would work against smallpox. So if you could give people cowpox, they'd be immune to smallpox. So Jenner's first experimental vaccine was given in 1796, and the idea was if you could give somebody an artificial cowpox, they would then be immune through the production of antibodies to smallpox. So it all makes sense to some degree, right? And also I don't want to kind of diss the microbe issue, because we know that microbes exist and they have a role to play. The key question is it a primary role? Are there other factors that are more important? So, and then we had the mass vaccination of smallpox in 1840, sometime after the initial experiments. Now, it's also worth looking at this idea of Edward Jenner being the founder of vaccination, because that also wasn't particularly true. For example, 1796, in a kind of rundown of the history of inoculation, we find that Denmark introduced inoculations in 1673. Remember that Edward Jenner was 1796. So we've got over 100 years before that. Wales in 1722, France in 1712, Ireland 1723, Germany 1724, and Italy 1754. So I want to give you the impression that actually what Edward Jenner did, like Pasteur, was to promote an idea. Right? Promote an idea that existed long before his time. And in fact, they'd used inoculations in these countries and got rid of them because they worked so badly and created more problems than they solved. again, just to kind of open the context with regards to this vaccination story. So let's have a look, just very briefly, at this vaccination thing. The idea is that the cowpox bug, which we later find is perhaps a virus, which they didn't know at the time, although they used the word virus, it had no relationship to what we understand by a virus now. So this cowpox virus would supposedly look like that, or label in C, and it was similar enough, let's say, to a smallpox virus. And the antibody, this thing that attaches to the cowpox, would be a similar one that could attach to the smallpox. And if you therefore had the illness cowpox, the antibodies would run around and would protect you against smallpox. The question is, why would you rather have cowpox than smallpox?
Not just dangerous.
Yeah, it's less dangerous, yeah? So there is the idea for that one disease is more dangerous than the other one, and as a corollary, one bug is more dangerous than the other bug. Does that make sense? So the smallpox bug, if you got it, was more dangerous than if you got the cowpox bug. So let's have the mild one, and we'll get immunity to that, and that will confer immunity to dangerous stuff along the way. So now we're starting to incorporate the medical paradigm that kind of reigns now. Is that we have diseases that are caused by these things, these agents, and these agents can cause dangerous illnesses or not, according to the nature of this agent. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a quick roll call of dangerous diseases. Right? So, names now. Let's not go too tropical on me, okay? So bear in mind that we live in Brighton, and name some dangerous diseases that you'd likely get here and that you might be afraid of, you might oh and ah about vaccinating and all this kind of stuff.
Swine flu.
Swine flu. Yeah, I haven't got swine flu. This came after my time. But why does everybody ask me about swine flu? Well, maybe we'll do that anyway. Somebody said something. Meningitis. Yeah, meningitis. Anything else? TB, tetanus, polio. Diphtheria, good stuff. Alright? Well, I might have put some other things down. So meningitis, encephalitis, which is the meninges around the brain, or encephalitis, the brain tissue itself, polio, TB, and etc. etc. Now, let's think of some less dangerous illnesses. Chickenpox, measles, germ measles, flu, mumps. Whooping cough, some people might consider rubella, etc. So let's see what we've got down here. Flu, mumps, chickenpox, and some fungal infections we might consider to be not that dangerous. Okay? So the question is, of all the things now, because remember we're talking about microbes, the microbes that cause meningitis, encephalitis, polio, TB, these microbes, is it possible to have these microbes in your body and not have any symptoms of disease at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do in fact most people have symptoms or most people don't have symptoms? Yeah, most people. When we say most people, well, like 99, whatever, don't have symptoms even though they have these microbes in their bodies. Okay? So then we go along to the less dangerous illness. Is it possible to die of those illnesses?
Not like
Yeah, in 1932, 3,000 people died of chickenpox, 500 people died of smallpox. Okay? So, not by all accounts, you can die of chickenpox. Mumps? Yeah. Fungal infections? Do you think? Yes, categorically yes. People with immune suppression, HIV, not HIV, it's about AIDS, and the AIDS-related complex, commonly die of a fungal infection. Right? So, okay. So the question therefore is, what makes an illness dangerous, a bug dangerous? Yeah, your susceptibility. Am I making sense? So it has to be something to do with your susceptibility. And often the paradigm that we put over is entirely related to the microbe and it's got nothing to do with the susceptibility of the patient. Alright? So go on a bit further. So let's have a look at the vaccine production as it exists now. So rather than try and find a similar illness, what we would tend to do is find somebody with an illness and get the actual microbe that we think is responsible for that. So if we're creating a measles virus, we would, measles vaccine rather, we would get somebody with measles, isolate the virus, that's another story, and then produce a vaccine by changing the virus slightly so it's not so dangerous. Does that make sense? And then we use that to create the vaccine. Okay? So there are certain things that we have to test for with regards to safety and effectiveness. Now the dilemma, of course, is that we need to get the real thing and that we need to change it in order to stimulate this antibody production. Now what happens if we change the pathogen, you know, this measles virus, too much? Sorry?
The antibody won't recognise it.
Yeah, that's kind of right. That's exactly right. But we just missed out a few things. So if we change the pathogen too much, the antibodies that you produce to it will not recognise the real pathogen. Does that make sense? So you will produce antibodies, but they won't recognise the real thing. So in effect, the vaccine potentially won't work. Does that make sense? So we therefore have to do an antibody fit type study. So these are the first kinds of studies that we do. So we'll create the changed virus, we inject it into tissue and whatever, and we get antibodies to it, and then we take those antibodies and we add them to the real pathogen, the real virus. And if they stick, as it were, then we know that we've got a potentially viable vaccine. We then test the vaccine in a small sample of the population, and we find if in fact these people produce that antibody, and if those antibodies are in sufficient numbers, and if they also attach to the pathogen, then it's like, hey, we're home and dry, given that it's safe, right? So let's assume it's safe, right? I remember I said that. Let's assume that it's safe. What else do we need to know about that vaccine that we still don't know? That we do need to know? Forgetting the safety issue. So with regards to effectiveness, what else do we need to know?
It's not temporary, it's going to be permanent.
Yeah, we might need to know how long it's going to last. Yeah. But that's a kind of detail. So if it doesn't, in terms of the vaccine working, what you would want to know in terms of a patient,
Side effect.
not forgetting safety. Oh, it's a really difficult one now, I know.
Does it work?
Yeah, does it work in doing what?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, preventing you getting the disease. Sounds really obvious, okay? But, sorry?
Oh, side effects.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So the side effects are going to come afterwards, right? So we're going to do the side effects on a separate issue. But we need to know, it's a bit like cancer therapy. We can get the tumour to shrink, but the patient still dies of cancer, right? Because we're focused on an outcome that isn't the fundamental outcome that we're looking at, right? And the fundamental outcome is my child or am I less likely to get this disease, even though I've got all these antibodies to these things that you say has caused this disease, right? And surprisingly, very few of those studies are done, right? Which is what we're going to look at as well. So the ones that we're looking at in terms of antibodies are called immunogenicity studies. They're just studies that tell us that you'll produce antibodies, but that's not telling you what you really need to know, right? So if you forget nothing else, remember that when you do your research. Now, what happens if, in fact, we don't change the pathogen enough? What could potentially go exactly? So what can happen is you're going to create the problem because you're now going to inject this potentially live thing inside your body, so now you're going to get the very thing that you wanted to avoid. Right? So we therefore have to look at safety issue with regards to the pathogen. Now, if we created a measles vaccine, we're going to find out if the measles vaccine is safe, have we changed it enough? We produce the vaccine, we inject it into a sample of the population, and we're going to be looking for symptoms. What kind of symptoms are we going to be looking for? Spots, exactly. Someone say spots? Exactly right. Okay. Fever, exactly right. You're always going to be right here. And so on. And that's all perfectly logical. And why would we look for those symptoms? Because they're the symptoms of measles, exactly. And what's wrong with only doing that? there might be other symptoms that don't look anything like measles. Okay? And this has been the big problem in vaccine research. In the early trials, is that they were blinkered towards looking at the symptoms of the illness that they were concerned with. So of course, there may be many other symptoms they would get. Probably stands to the reason there would be other symptoms, because of course, the way in which you inject measles is not the way in which you would contract measles. There are other things in the vaccine other than the measles virus and so on, etc., etc. The other issue is that when we compare, this is the big point, guys, when people say in the vaccine industry that the side effects of the vaccine is 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million or whatever it is, but the side effects or the adverse events from measles is greater, these are not comparable groups, because the vaccine research has been done on healthy people. Do you understand that? And these are people that will not have adverse events when they get measles, right? So the people that have got kidney diseases and leukemia, they're not in the vaccine research. So you've got no way of comparing those two groups. So that is just complete nonsense to say that the side effects of the vaccine is this, and the side effects of the illness is that, because they're completely non-comparable groups. So that is also something we have to bear in mind. I want to find out how these vaccines are working and what they're doing. So, and the other issue is that once the vaccine is deemed relatively safe and relatively effective, we then have what they kind of call phase 4 trials, or trials where they're allowed to have the medication or the intervention in the population, but they then have to monitor side effects. Does that make sense? So say, well, it's okay, but you need to monitor the side effects. The problem with that, of course, is that things tend to slip under the carpet and slip by people's notice. And there is a legal framework for compensating people that are vaccine damaged. And that legal framework tends to influence what people consider to be vaccine damage. Right? So there are different ways of making vaccines, but some of them are considered live and some of them are considered dead, to cut a long story short. But if you've had, for example, a live vaccine, you would be given 14 days. If you have your symptoms outside of that 14-day period, it's unlikely, they say, to be caused by a vaccine, and you wouldn't be eligible for vaccine compensation, in this country at least. And if you've had it for 3 days, if you've had symptoms outside of 3 days from a killed vaccine, then again you wouldn't be eligible for compensation. So those time limits are relatively short, as you can imagine, yeah? So not only are we blinkering the symptoms, we're also blinkering the time limit. So let's just have a look at that time limit issue. Some people may have heard of Vera Scheiber, yeah? She's written a book, 100 Years of Vaccination. And she worked with her partner, I believe, developing a cot watch monitor. It monitored the breathing pattern of babies, and it was to set off alarm if the breathing pattern was to show a stressed breathing pattern. And it was to try and alert parents to the possibility of cot death. And so this monitor had to distinguish the breath from the heartbeat, because if you get the heartbeat, it doesn't tend to react as sensitively as the breath. So having done this, they found something. They found that if you had a trauma, let's say on day 1, you'd have this stressed breathing pattern, but then it would go back to normal. And then it would kind of go a bit stressed again on roughly day 3, day 14 and day 30. So what was significant was that you didn't get all of your stressed breathing pattern on day 1 that petered out in a linear fashion over time. So all of the reactions actually wouldn't happen on day 1. Right? And they found that people were more likely to get ill on those particular days. They would get symptoms on this day, they would die down, they would have symptoms on this day and that day and so on. What was interesting for Vera is that she would have these long traces of breathing patterns, because they would stick these monitors in the cots for weeks and weeks and weeks, and months in fact. And they found that if they could see this concertina pattern, they could predict when the day of trauma was. And she found that the day of trauma was often the vaccination day. And when she took these traces to other professionals that were doing this kind of work, they would almost always agree on when the day of trauma was. But to her frustration, they would never admit that the vaccine could have anything to do with the trauma. So that led Vera on her little crusade and tirade to tell people about the issues of vaccination. But this also informs us that you won't necessarily get all those symptoms in 3 days, you won't necessarily even get all those symptoms in 14 days, etc., etc. Okay, the immune system is a fairly complex animal, let's say, and we know a lot more about the immune system now in 2000s than we did in the 19th century. And it's very possible that you could have a very good immune response to something, and because your immune system is so kind of multifaceted and wide and varied, that may not involve antibodies, because there's so many other cells and parts of your body that are involved in your immune system, right? So you could effectively be immune and not have antibodies to something, right? It's also possible, given the nature of responses and how they can fail and so on, that you could have antibodies and may not yet be immune to something, right? So you could have antibodies and not be immune. You could have no antibodies and be immune, right? Now, do you think, kind of in general terms, that that's a proposition that vaccine promoters would uphold? What's your first impression? No. Categorical no. So this question was asked to Dr. Clements, who was the director and probably still is, I don't know, of the World Health Organization vaccine program. So it's quite possible he has the biggest budget that exists worldwide to vaccinate people. And he was basically asked, is it possible you can have people with antibodies and they're not immune and people without an arm? And he said in 1995, yes, you're right to say there's not a precise relationship between seroresponse, production of antibodies and protection. Immunity can be demonstrated in individuals with very low or no detectable levels of antibody. Okay? So he goes on to say other things. He said this is why you have to do other kinds of studies. You can't really know whether a vaccine works just by simply doing antibody tests. So what's the general consensus that there is as to how we know that vaccines work out in the world out there? How do people know that vaccines work? Exactly. Because there's been a decline in incidence of diseases. Right? Now, there can be a decline, there may be no decline, but what may also show that a vaccine is working? Less deaths. So effectively, the disease becomes less dangerous. So we'd give both of those a valid reason to vaccinate. Right? They brought down the number of cases of illness, and if they brought down the... you can see that the incidence of diphtheria has gone down since the 1950s, and it appears, because the vaccine was introduced in the 40s, that this was due to the vaccine. But what else, what is kind of missing from the picture, as it were? Yeah, we don't know what else may have contributed to that decline. So what we really want is a kind of before and after. Yeah? Just like the kind of Elle McPherson video. Yeah? You too can have a body like this if you did 3 lots of 20-minute exercises on this video and hey, you can look like me.
Is that just in the West or is that worldwide?
This is UK.
This is UK.
Right? But we need a before and after. We need a before and after. But the problem is that there was no diphtheria wasn't a notifiable disease before the 1950s. So there were no reliable notification figures. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the death rate. And death rate is a reflection of severity. What we're also going to see, not in this particular instance, is that severity and incidence generally parallel each other. Right? I don't know if there's any disease that goes up in incidence and down in severity, or up in severity and down. They tend to parallel each other. So they reflect one on the other. So if we go back 100 years, so to 1860 or here, the graph that we looked at earlier actually started here. Right? It started right at the end. And so from that picture at least, we can see there's a substantial decline before the vaccine was introduced. So the question therefore remains, what did the vaccine contribute over and above what was already happening? Right? So again, it's not to say the vaccine didn't do anything, but now it's a slightly different picture. It's a slightly different question we're asking. We need to know what did it do over and above what was happening anyway. So that was diphtheria. So let's have a look at whooping cough, a similar story, a decline in incidence of whooping cough. The question remains what happened before. If we look at severity as related to death rate, we can see that that end arrow is when the vaccine was introduced. Okay? So again, a marked reduction in death rate before the vaccine came along. So the question that therefore remains, what did the vaccine do compared to what was happening anyway? All right? So let's go to tetanus. 70, can't see the numbers quite there, but that's 1970. Kind of a decline, given that. We go back in time to 1905. The vaccine was introduced at some period, 70s I believe. We can see, again, quite a marked decline before the vaccine came along. This is our example of incidence and death rate together. So this is TB, right? And the solid line at the bottom is death rate, and the dashed line is incidence. You can see that they kind of parallel each other, and they went down since the 40s. And again, we have the same question: what happened before? If we go back to 1838, we can see that the death rate had plummeted well before the vaccine came along. The vaccine was introduced right at the end there, the BCG vaccine, and so on. Actually, depending on what part of the world you're in, as to when you got the vaccine. So that was so far we've probably done what we've done: diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, TB. Let's have a look at measles. This is the single measles. I haven't bothered with the MMR. Okay, so the MMR is more difficult because it's a multiple vaccine. You're looking at several vaccines at once. The single measles vaccine introduced in 1968. Okay, this is 20 years before the MMR. What's the significance of 20 years? Do you know? How long does a patent last? 20 years. Okay. Often vaccines change as the patent life runs out. Yes, you heard it here. So the vaccine may be perfectly okay in their context even, but because the patent life runs out, they're not going to make any money, or they make very little money out of it. And the drug industry make most of their money through patented medications. If the generic drug comes out made by people in God knows where, they can make a fraction of the cost and the whole industry collapses. So in any event, 1968, single measles introduced. As a consequence, it looks like the incidence came down. Let's have a look at death rate again. We can see the vaccine introduced right at the end. There are other things to take into account, but what we're looking at is clearly an effect from other things other than the vaccine. It's the only point I want to make. The other point is that these graphs that show death rate are from the same office that produced the other graphs. Okay, they're OPCS, the Office of Population and Consensus. They're now called something else, Office of National Statistics. But they produce these death rate figures and they produce the other incidence figures. So it's not a separate study done by a bunch of homeopaths with some axe to grind. These are death rate figures in the same office. So now, this is more interesting, I think, because here we have scarlet fever. Now, the interesting thing about scarlet fever, go back to the 1850s, scarlet fever. Right? 2,300 per million deaths. Right? And if we go back to measles, right, although that looked quite high, scarlet fever doubles that. Right? And nothing else comes close to scarlet fever death rate in the 1860s. And the interesting thing about scarlet fever is what? We've never had a vaccine. Right? So this idea that suddenly we're going to get all these deaths coming back because we don't have vaccines doesn't seem to bear true to the illnesses where we don't have vaccines. Right? So that's just something worth bearing in mind. The other thing, of course,
why is there no scarlet fever vaccine?
Because the decline beat the drug company to the post. Or, as they say, it was very difficult to make a vaccine. Right? One of the two. But anyway, moving swiftly on. Smallpox is kind of interesting, right? Because this is the disease we say we've eradicated from the world because of the vaccine. Yeah? Never managed to do it with any other illness. Okay? We've eradicated smallpox from the world. So let's just have a look at this. What's interesting about smallpox vaccine is that this vaccine was introduced in 1840. So when everything else that we saw was the kind of 1950s and 30s and so on, this was 100 years before. So if anything, we should show a good decline in smallpox. Does that make sense? So let's have a look. Introduced in 1840, made compulsory in 1853. Whatever that means, right? We'll know what that means in a minute. So let's have a look at it. Between 57 and 59, there were 14,000 deaths in smallpox. Let's go to 20 years later, 63 and 65, 7% population rise, death rate rose by 40% to 20,000. So in fact, the only disease death rate that was going up from the 1840s. Remember, everything else was coming down, smallpox is going up. The only illness that we have a vaccine for. Right? 1867 should be kind of pertinent to the news these days. Invaders of vaccination were prosecuted. Those left vaccinated, unvaccinated, very few. It's the only mandated vaccine that we've ever had. Vaccine that you had to have. Right? In the news now, there's this idea that we might want to introduce a similar protocol now. But anyway, those left unvaccinated, very few. So we go to 30 years after the first smallpox vaccine. 1772, population rise of 9%, the death rate rose by 123%. So here we see an illness going up, everything else is going down, and is in fact the only illness that we're vaccinating for. So it doesn't kind of run true, to the stats at least, that smallpox vaccine was responsible for the eradication of smallpox. Of course, in time, smallpox deaths came down, as did every other illness. So at a time, as we say, and all our death rates were going down, smallpox was going up. So let's have a look at this. Let's look at the other stuff, right? What contributes to the decline of disease over time that could also be wrongly affected to vaccine? What we were saying there is that there are other factors, right? Other health issues. So other people mentioned sanitation, nutrition, and so on. So all those things would have been responsible for the decline in death rates that we saw from 1850 to 1950 before some of these vaccines were introduced. Now, what other factors, and this will be interesting to the question about the Green Book, what other factors will influence the graph other than health? Sorry? It would actually, if people brought the disease in. Yeah. But what could make it go down? Because what I'm asking is, what could make a graph go down when you might think it's the vaccine when in fact it's not? Yeah, all that health stuff, which is what that, right? Is there anything else? They're all population adjusted, they're all rate adjusted to the population.
It not actually being like the wrong, they think it's something else.
Yeah, so we have the reporting issue, right? We have to standardise reporting, that makes sense. So what we're relying on in all those graphs is that we're getting accurate reporting of measles, diphtheria, okay? So let's look at an issue here, especially let's look at this numbers business as well. So when you think of an epidemic, what percentage of the population do you think we're talking about?
1%.
Which?
5%.
5%? And advance? 30? Okay, we're wrong with that. Okay. So polio, 35 cases in 100,000. There's a polio epidemic. That's 0.035%. Before 1955, there was 20 cases. And other illnesses are less than that. Okay. So now we have a measles epidemic. What do you think the kind of figure is as a population? It's about 2 in 100,000. Okay. Now, what that means, okay, what's your average GP listing? How many people is a GP listing? Do you think? How many? Not too far. 2,000 or 3,000, let's say. Right? So it's quite easy that a GP wouldn't have any of those cases on their books. Right? It's quite common that a GP might only have 1 or 2. Somebody might have 3 or 4, another 10 GPs have none. You see the point I'm making? If there's a small error with the way that people do things, that's multiplied up considerably when we have reporting and so on. Right? So I just want you to be aware of the numbers. It's a very tricky issue. Okay, it's a very tricky issue. It's not as easy as it appears. Now, that BMJ article is really useful. BMJ, 22nd of July, 2006. And what this article shows is that whooping cough, for example, is very common in England, right? But it's not reported in people that are vaccinated, right? And so it's in the British Medical Journal. It's a fairly orthodox medical journal. It's conducted by fairly orthodox scientists, and they're saying that basically the immune state, the vaccination status, tends to influence someone's diagnosis. So if you've got a measles vaccine and you've been vaccinated, you're more unlikely or less likely to be diagnosed with that illness. And this is something that this article has found, right? So that makes those statistics very unreliable indeed. Okay? So let's have a look at another example of that. In the States, there was a TV program in the 80s called VPT Vaccine Roulette, which sounds like a game show. got to kind of someone wants to work with me. But it was a documentary about the dangers of DPT vaccine, and in particular the pertussis element, which is the whooping cough element. And as a result of some research, they found that whooping cough element could in fact cause neurological damage, epilepsy, and even cot death. So as a result of that program, people were vaccinated less with the whooping cough element because they got scared, and they would use the D and the T alone. Right? So consequently, less people were being vaccinated with whooping cough vaccine. What happened to the numbers of whooping cough cases in being reported in the States? They went up. Okay? So Dr. Anthony Morris, who's a member of the FDA, he went to have a look at 2 states where they had epidemics. So we're looking at, 3,500,000. And there were in fact 40 odd cases in one, and a similar amount of cases in another. And he had these cases analysed, and in fact he could confirm 5 cases in one and 16 cases in another. So in total 21 cases could be confirmed in those 2 states, and that brought it below their supposed epidemic levels. What he said was that whooping cough was being over-reported where doctors expected to see it. Right? But more importantly than this, that of all the 21 cases that were confirmed cases, they had all been vaccinated against whooping cough. Okay? So he then went on to say that clearly he wouldn't have found those cases had this TV program not appeared. And so it's very possible that whooping cough cases are being underreported to vaccinated individuals. That's exactly what this research goes on to say 20 odd years later, as reported in the BMJ. So we have an issue with reporting, let's say. Right? We have an issue with reporting. We also have an issue with classification. When is a disease a disease? When is something polio? When is it something else? So what have we got down here? For example, poliovirus, which we vaccinate against what they call wild type 1, 2, and 3. Wild type, so there are 3 forms of polioviruses that we vaccinate against, and there are in fact 72. We've later found 72 viruses that can be there in the neurological tissue in somebody that has paralysis that's exactly like poliomyelitis. Right? But if we see those other viruses, this isn't called polio. So now we have more diseases, or more disease classifications, for what is ostensibly the same disease. Right? We have more disease classifications for what is ostensibly the same disease. What's also interesting is that polio can in fact last 24 hours or a number of days, and things revert back to normal fairly quickly. Right? We don't talk about it there. But in any event, what's more interesting with polio is what we call post-polio syndrome. The paralysis that lasts, or the brain inflammation that lasts, or the brain damage that lasts, and so on. So it's the stuff that goes on. And that is called post-polio syndrome. If you get the same syndrome of illness from these other viruses, so for example, Coxsackie virus of the same family, Eco virus of the same family, these illnesses are called post-viral syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. This is not my classification, it's a medical classification. So what we're finding therefore, again, from these chronic illnesses, what would have been called one thing is now 4, half a dozen different things. So therefore the numbers of illnesses are going to go down simply because we're reclassifying them and changing the numbers. Pretty much as we do with unemployment figures and all this kind of stuff. So it doesn't kind of work too well for us in terms of health. The other thing with regards to viruses, and you're going to have to look this up because it's also a very controversial issue. But if you think about something that's living, right? What can something living do? From babies to adults, to animals, to plants, to bacteria, to fungus, they can adapt. Let's do some really basic things they have to do. They can multiply, they can move, they can die. Multiply, move, die. They can respire, they can take in some kind of substrate and they can create energy. And what else do they have to do if they're going to take in something? They have to excrete. So it's about 7 things, and we've kind of roughly got them. Right? Now viruses can do none of those things. Can't do any of those things. So it's debatable, highly debatable whether you would consider a virus a live thing. It's actually a piece of DNA in the membrane. So, but the issue gets far more involved than this. It's very simple, everything is very simple, but it's more than we've got time for. If you really want to look at this, there's a guy called Stefan Lanka who can easily get in by doing a little Google search or whatever search engine you use. And he was a virologist, and he has found and isolated viruses, and he's basically saying that the people that do medical research on viruses are very, very slack. They're not really isolating viruses. Right? And it gets a bit more controversial than that, but anyway, it's worth a look. Okay. So we don't actually know whether these things are the result of the disease or the cause of the disease. Okay. There we go, first focus. And suppression. And this might be actually the most important issue, is that if you take a procedure, a vaccine or whatever, to do something, and it's the kind of side effects issue, right? That graph shows you that measles is going down. But what it isn't showing you is what else is happening to your child or your children. Does that make sense? So yeah, I could do something, or people can do something that will stop you getting a headache, or stop you getting morning sickness, or stop you getting this, that, and the other. But what's the cost of that? All right? And this is a question that kind of got me involved in the vaccine issue, because I thought it was as simple as that. It was only when delving a little further that you realise it's slightly more complex. But in any event, this is a very fundamental issue for people in alternative medicine, or rather holistic medicine, because we tend to try and look at the bigger picture. Say, okay, you can do that with that symptom, but what's the cost of that? Okay? So do you have an example? We don't have one written, I don't think. But for example, MMR vaccine in '92 in Canada was shown to be causing mumps encephalitis in certain people. So the mumps component of the MMR vaccine was causing mumps encephalitis. So it was causing a brain inflammation from a mumps vaccine, which was ordinarily a fairly benign tissue gland disease. All right, so we're going from a kind of externally gland disease to a brain inflammation. So the cost of that is obviously far too high. Yeah, you'd rather have mumps than encephalitis. So they withdrew the vaccine. Just have a look at the numbers. In this country, we didn't have a viable alternative, so we stayed with that particular MMR. And the mumps encephalitis rate was something like 1 in 143,000. So we thought that was an acceptable level of collateral damage. What we have to understand is that there is a level of collateral damage. The issue is, what is the number? Right? 143,000 they thought was okay. So our government set up a scientific office to investigate the numbers of mumps encephalitis from this strain of MMR. And they found that actually in some instances as high as 1 in 20,000, in other instances as high as 1 in 4,000. 1 in 4,000 is 25 in 100,000. 25 in 100,000 is basically epidemic levels of mumps encephalitis occurring in the population, and we only found out when we set up an office to have a look. Do you see my point? So it's very easy for this to go unnoticed. And it's very easy for the relatively small adverse events from an illness, and actually the small case of an illness, to be surpassed by the adverse events of a vaccine without us noticing, because the numbers are all very small. We make it sound like we have massive numbers of adverse events, massive numbers of diseases from these illnesses, and then we give a vaccine, it all goes down. Well, it isn't like that. They're very small numbers, we don't know how effective they are, we don't know how dangerous they are, and they could easily out-tip the balance. As a consequence, we withdrew that vaccine, and there's more to the stories that we don't have time for. But in any event, we then introduced another vaccine, which we're using now. So we have all these issues to take into account with regards to figuring out, does a vaccine work, is it effective, and is it safe? All right? So, how can we find out what vaccines are doing? What kind of a trial could we set up that would actually overcome most of those issues quite easily? What would we have to do? It's not a trick question, it's very straightforward.
Just compare vaccinated and unvaccinated population.
Exactly. You would compare a vaccinated group with a non-vaccinated group, you'd have a comparable group. Right? So you'd kind of have to do what we call, could you tell the unvaccinated group that they were being unvaccinated? No. They would be your control group. So ideally, they would be your placebo group. Right? So you would give them something that looked like a vaccine, but in fact, there was nothing in it. There's saline or something, or water or whatever, that we hope is innocuous. All right? So that will be our control group. And similarly, tell you a little story, in World War II, a particular hospital tent, as it were, ran out of morphine, so they had nothing basically to give their soldiers and their wounded victims when they were going to perform these operations. Fairly serious operations, cutting limbs off and opening them up and taking bits out of them. They had no painkilling drug. So what did they use instead? Saline solution, right? Accidentally, actually, at first. But in any event, they used saline solution, they found it worked. So so they conducted these major operations under the influence of saltwater solution. We know that can happen now because we have endorphins and caffeines, these natural painkillers. They're actually very many more times powerful than morphine or whatever. It's quite difficult to get them to work sometimes, right? Because we get a bit stressed. We've got bits hanging off. So when did the saline solution stop working? When people knew, when who knew? No.
Good stuff.
The staff, the anaesthetists, the people administering the solution. When they found out that they were giving the salt solution, the effectiveness started to wane. And there was a hum around the tent. We've run out of X, Y, Z. But in any event, so that's well known. So what do? We have a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. It's what we do, what medics do, what the pharmaceutical industry does, hopefully for their drugs, all right? And you can pay half vaccinated, you don't tell them placebo, we don't tell the vaccinated, therefore double-blind. And we randomise from the same sample. So unlike with this thing where you take a sample of people and compare them to the disease group, you have to take the same bunch of people, you vaccinate half, compare one with the other. Right? So the question is, how many trials like this have to be conducted for vaccines before a vaccine is introduced as public health policy? How many vaccines? None. Who agrees? None. Okay, why? Why don't we do placebo-controlled trials for vaccines?
The whole paradigm is that vaccines are good and they work and there's no reason to do.
Well, you're on the right lines.
Would it be considered ethical?
It wouldn't be considered ethical because...
Oh, yes, but it's because you're putting yourself at risk by not vaccinating.
Exactly. It wouldn't be considered ethical to non-vaccinate to create a placebo group because basically you're putting them at risk. And so what's the argument? What are we doing there? What's the assumption? They work. And not only do they work, they're safer than doing nothing. Right? So it's inherent in the argument that says it's unethical that they work. Right? So let's just look at that. Let's just look at a statement just so that you get that I'm not the only one saying this. Right? BMJ, 28th of October 2006. This particular guy was talking. So again, British Medical Journal. What I want you to show you is it's not a kind of science versus holistic medicine debate. Actually, the debate is going on within the science world. Right? They're talking about flu vaccine and basically how useless the flu vaccine is. But in talking about vaccines, he says the inception of a vaccination campaign seems to preclude the assessment of a vaccine through placebo-controlled randomised trials on ethical grounds, what we've just said. Far from being unethical, however, such trials are desperately needed and we should invest in them without delay. Right, so these are the situations that exist. So we're having to kind of work out after the event what these vaccines do, which is of course very difficult. So, let's have a look at a TB trial that is in fact a placebo-controlled trial, because they have been carried out. Although they don't have to do them, there's nothing to stop East Sussex Health Authority from conducting its own trials. Nothing to stop the British government from conducting its own trials. There's nothing to stop the World Health Organization. Do you get my point? Even though drug companies don't have to do it, as far as FDA approval and all this kind of stuff is concerned, people can do them. So let's look at a TB trial that was reported or reviewed at least in the Lancet Jan 12, 1980. There aren't many of them, so we have to go far and wide. So this is what the Lancet has to say. After a serious accident in the production of the TB vaccine, BCG, the 72 children there within a few months of vaccination, the first well-controlled vaccines was organised. So basically, and remember how small the incidents are and also how or in comparison death rates are, this was a major cock-up. I think it was something to do with taking the wrong bit of the vaccine. Anyway, they managed to kill 72 children. And then they thought, maybe we should test this vaccine out. Right? Anyway, there were 20 years of trials that followed from 1935 to 1955. Their results varied strikingly and mysteriously from 0% to 80% effectiveness. So in quote, this is what the Lancet says. Consequently, in the 70s, the largest placebo-controlled trial was carried out using 260,000 participants, comparing equal-sized placebo group with equal-sized vaccinated group. Right? What did this trial find? Not only results showed no evidence of a protective effect, but slightly more TB cases appeared in the vaccinated group than in the non-vaccinated group. So actually, although not statistically significantly a great deal, however, you were more likely to have TB had you been vaccinated than had you not been vaccinated. So what happened as a result of that trial? They stopped vaccinating and then we never give BCG again. No, that didn't happen.
Didn't run any more tests.
Sorry?
Stopped running tests.
Well, interestingly, what should have happened? What's the least that could have happened?
Debate about it.
Debate, yeah?
Research.
Did another test.
Yeah, exactly. The least that should have happened, that they should have conducted another test, which they didn't do. Okay? So what happened?
Didn't change the text.
Basically nothing. Okay? Basically nothing. They sat on the results for a number of years. They eventually published it in Germany, where the original accident happened. This study was conducted in India, by the way. They campaigned actually to remove the vaccine from their kind of required list. And after, I think, 11 years, they did manage to remove the TB vaccine. But in any event, what I'm trying to show you is how things get ignored and how we don't do the studies that we need to do and so on and so forth. So, what we're going to do now? We're now going to do something else, okay? So that we can try and understand what's going on. What I've kind of done to some degree is set up a load of question marks. Right, I'm saying that we're not really testing these things. I'm saying they're more dangerous than we think they are, and they're not as effective as we're being told. Right? So let's have a look at the human body in a slightly more holistic point of view, and see if we can understand what is going on. So let's imagine that you hold something in your hand. We could consider that to be outside of your body. Yeah? And if you put it in your mouth, it's outside your body. And if it went down your esophagus, it's outside your body. If it goes into your stomach, it's outside your body. Just bear with me for a while. If it goes into your intestines, it's outside your body. And if it came out your bum, it never went in your body. Right? So if you swallowed a marble, and at some point in the future, depending on what your digestive system was like, you hear this chink in the toilet. At no point did that marble go inside your body. All it did is just kind of run through that tube that runs through the middle of you. Yeah? So we're kind of like donuts. Right? Present company accepted. Yeah, exactly. And it's, whatever you push through the hole doesn't go in the donut unless you pierce the skin. Yeah? So, and therefore, what has to pierce the skin then gets into the body. Anything inside that space is ostensibly outside the body. And that's what we're going to work with for the purposes of today. Right? So, what we're going to see is that the immune response is in fact a whole body process. It's quite a false delineation to say that your immune system are the immune cells, like the T cells, the B cells, the natural killer cells, all these things that we think classically in terms of the immune system. It's actually pretty false. So, for example, we have now a discipline called PNI. It's psychoneuroimmunology, because it's looking at how the psychology is related to the nervous system, is related to the immune system. It's actually all one system. Okay? And when we do something with all our systems. You can't eat without your digestive system, and also without your cardiovascular system, without your immune system, without your endocrine system, and so on. They all work together synergistically to do stuff. Right? So we kind of have to make the immune system slightly bigger than we tend to do. So let's just say it's a whole body process. And the membrane bit is very important. That's the bit here that we're talking about. Is that membrane that lines the digestive tract is a continuous membrane with your skin. Okay? It's also continuous with the trachea and into your lung membrane, and also continuous with your genitourinary tract and right up into the kidney tubules. That membrane separates your inside from your outside. And what's significant about that membrane is that out onto that membrane we eliminate our toxins. Okay? So if you could imagine a situation whereby we live on top of a hill, I'll just add some water here, and we breathe totally pure air, and we had biodynamic organic food, and there were no toxins, and there were no mother, fine masks, and there were no computers, and everything we touched was made out of wood, and so on. Right? And we all went together in this big happy commune at Big Steiner School at the top. Even if we could live like that, and I don't know if my child goes to Steiner School, so even if we could live like that, we would, if we didn't eliminate our toxins, we would die within 1 or 2 minutes, let's say. Okay? So one of the things that we have to appreciate is that our bodies are always producing toxins, even though we obsess about all the stuff that we're putting in. It's all very well and good, and it's all valid, it's all important, but we have to remember that our bodies are producing toxins all the time, and we have to eliminate them. So how do we eliminate them? Yeah, what's the process called? Be as simple as you want. So respiration is one way of eliminating toxins. We eliminate the carbon dioxide, it reduces the acids in the body and the gases and so on. What else do we do that eliminate? Perspiration, defecation, and urination, as you were just about to comment. So these are all things that we're doing, and whilst we're doing that we have no symptoms of disease, we're just peeing and pooing and sweating and breathing and everything's hunky-dory. Alright? Okay, now a child's system, like a child at day 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, we can appreciate all of those systems are underdeveloped. Does that make sense? Their systems have to develop between then and an adult. Okay, so the things you can do to us that you can't do to them. Right? And therefore, if we think about food, and that's just a representation of food, it's not cannabis. And I've suddenly come to realise is that what might be food for an adult might be a problem for a child, let's say, right? Because a child has to develop all kinds of enzymes from its liver, from its pancreas, has to be able to produce bile, and all this stuff to break down the food, okay? And the membrane has to develop in order to keep that food out. So as an adult, you take in all kinds of stuff, and you can keep it in your digestive tract until you've broken it down into the small bits that allow you to absorb that food. Does that make sense? If you did that to a child too soon, then the big bits would get in, and you'd poison the child, you'd poison their blood system, and you'd poison their systems generally. So what you do with a child is you give them almost what we could consider to be pre-digested food. They have to do very little digestion. Right? So you give them breast milk or some formula milk or something where it's virtually broken down, they break down a couple of little bits of it and it wham, it gets absorbed into the blood system and so on. And as they develop, they can add to that process. Now, if it is a problem, let's take a child and you give them something too soon, how are they going to react, do you think?
Vomit.
They're going to vomit, right? And if it gets down, diarrhea, right? So it's all fairly straightforward stuff. And sometimes it's green, sometimes it's not. But in any event, what you have is a reaction to a problem. And this is the second most important thing about tonight, is there is a difference between the reaction and the problem. Now, the problem with a pharmaceutically driven led medicine is that we're apt to perceive the reaction as the problem, right? And consequently, if you go to the pharmacist or whatever and you say that I'm vomiting, what are you going to do with your reaction if that's the problem?
Stop the vomiting.
You're going to stop the vomiting. You're going to try and do something to stop what you perceive to be the problem. So what's the potential danger in that?
You might have something more.
A lot of toxins.
Yeah.
You lock the toxins into the body. You actually don't allow the body to do what it's designed to do. Right? And that's a big, big issue in holistic medicine compared to a pharmaceutically driven medication. So what we're doing is we try and distinguish the reaction from the problem. So when we're looking at this issue of vaccines and so on, which we'll come on to, this is not an issue of we have a better vaccine than you. What I'm trying to do, at least, and what many people are trying to do, is let's try and understand this picture, let's try and understand this issue in a slightly bigger perspective, in a slightly broader perspective, to see whether in fact you would want to vaccinate your children, to see whether in fact there might be perceptibly better ways of doing it, and to see whether in fact we can understand what and why is happening with vaccinated children. So what we're alluding to here is this idea of an intelligent body-mind. Right? Is that something happens, you react based on the intelligence of your body. Am I making sense? I'm sure she'll be fine. Okay. Now the other issue is that what can potentially happen now is if toxins are in the body, if we go back to Béchamp and all these other holistic practitioners, what they're kind of saying is that that's now when we can let these things grow. We can let fungal cells grow and get out of hand, we can let bacteria grow and get out of hand. And we know that happens in the body. We know that happens when there is toxicity in certain parts of the body. And this doesn't only relate to the digestive tract, we can do the same thing with the respiratory tract with regards to phlegm, nasal discharge, coughing, sneezing and so on. And we can just run through a whole host of immunological responses that are in fact responses to things. I'm just going to use this as an example. So therefore the debate is the bug the cause, right, or is it an effect? Did it come afterwards? Does it help or does it hinder? Right? Because there are also people that study certain bacteria, and they say actually those things help to break down the toxins. Right? And so often what we're doing, we see a culture that's now growing up around a kind of probiotic culture. In fact, let's add some bugs to the body so that you can have a good immune system. So we're seeing something slightly different going on here. So as we said, if reactions perceived to be the problem, we then end up with this issue of suppression. So there's something I want us to really kind of take home and remember that we have to question what it is we're doing when we stop somebody having a symptom. Now this may be relevant and it may be useful in what we would consider to be accident and emergency procedures, trauma medicine, when in fact the reaction can be a problem. So for example, let's say you've got diarrhea and it's going on and on and on and on and on, you're dehydrating and you're going to die from dehydration, which people do in developing countries, right? Die from diarrhea, diarrheal diseases. You might want to stop that. Does that make sense? But you have to hold that within the context of when you would want to do that and when you would not want to do that. The danger, of course, is you apply that rationale to all kinds of medical scenarios, which is what the pharmaceutical industry is about. It's about expanding their market, as it were. So much so that now we have well documented and well written about in various journals and so on, how the drug industry is trying to apply medication into what they call the well-worried. Okay? People that have symptoms that don't really fit under classification of pathology, but we could tweak those symptoms with medication. So, you know, any kind of depression, any kind of sadness, we can just tweak that, as it were, with a drug, and you'd be okay. Right? You don't have to worry about what you're sad about and all that kind of stuff. Forget all that nonsense. You just take the drug to tweak the issue, and everything will be fine.